welcome everybody to our April meeting of the Historical Society. So I want to set the stage for what we're going to hear about tonight. So think of the 1950s, a little town in Kansas of about 4,000, a family that has a house with a dining room that serves as the television room and the family room, and all across the floor is Tinker Toys and American bricks and erector set. It's an absolute mess. And then downstairs in the basement is the one huge plywood piece that has electric train set with all kinds of locomotives and barns and fields and just loaded with everything. And this young man goes on to become an engineer of both mills that General Mills builds, and he helped build those, and of course an engineer in his ongoing electric train set. So tonight we have another Midwesterner, happens to be from Indiana, who has also gone on to be an electrical engineer, as well as an engineer that we're going to hear about tonight. So Stuart Brorson is our speaker tonight. Besides being interested in trains, Stuart is really an avid historian. And because of that, the Historical Society has benefited tremendously. He has been a past president for us. He's also has done other lectures for us. In fact, one that he did was on the history of triple-deckers. And you might notice in the display here, there are quite a few triple-deckers. So when I asked Stuart I knew that he had a train collection, and this is our theme this year, is collections, and I thought, well, this is going to make a fabulous program. So give us a fabulous program, Stuart.
Oh, thank you. I'll do my best. Thank you, Patsy. Thank you very much. I thought you were supposed to applaud at the end, but we'll see. We'll see if that happens. It depends on the quality of the talk. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Patsy. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and see so many familiar faces. It's great. Tonight I'm going to talk about a different one of my activities, which, as you know, is model trains. And I want you to take a look at this, because remember, one of the things I said I would do is answer the question of, why do we expect a model train to be around the Christmas tree at Christmas time? And well, here we see in the 1950s advertisement for Lionel a suggestion that there's no thrill like his first Christmas with Lionel trains. There we go. So if you think about models of trains, you have to come to the realization pretty quickly that models of trains have been around probably since the beginning of the railroad era, say the 1820s in this country, because you have to have patent models. If you want to patent something that goes into a train, you have to have, if you're an engineer and you're designing trains or portions of trains or engines, typically at that time, rather than drawing it up in CAD, you would make some sort of model. And then, of course, making handmade toys has been around forever. And so you have to think that from the get-go there have been model trains out there. And as I was researching this subject, so that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm really going to focus on is model trains for children. And as I was researching this subject, I came across this, something I was unaware of, but it's very interesting. The first model train that we have any sort of record of, as opposed to some folk art that was done by some person, is this 1859 model railroad that was built in a park in Paris by this guy here. That's Napoleon III, who basically was the only president of France during the Second Republic in the first half and middle part of the 19th century, and then he made himself emperor after that, became a dictator. He did a lot of things for Paris, including bring in the Baron von Haussmann. If you've been in Paris and you see the wide boulevards and the modern, for that time, architecture, that was all because of this guy right here. Well, another thing he did was he made this train layout in a park for his son. For his son. The Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial. And I will read a little description of it that was published in Le Monde Illustré in 1859. I will not read it in French because I would not be able to do that. It says, "The railway built for the amusement of the Prince Imperial is a real toy as well as a masterpiece of mechanical science. It has been set up in a corner of the private park of St. Cloud. Its track is in the shape of a figure 8, and you can see that here. And the curvature of its tiny rails is reminiscent of the surprising curves of the railway from Paris to Sceaux. It has a small station, small viaducts, small bridges, and small inclines and ramps, and there you can see it. The engine itself, which is about 50 centimeters wide, has wheels driven by an internal spring and can be wound up as desired. So it's a wind-up engine that pulls the train there. So the Prince Imperial did not have as illustrious a career as his father because, unfortunately, after Napoleon III, he got involved in several wars besides essentially declaring himself emperor. He eventually was killed in a war and killed in battle, and so his son had to leave, and so he left for England, where he ended up being in the British Army, and he was also killed in a battle, killed by Zulus in a battle in Africa. So sadly for him, and that happened at an early age, so sadly for him, he didn't have the same illustrious career as his father. So that's sort of an interesting one-off, and as I was researching this, I discovered this. But it isn't quite what I want to talk about, because when I think about model trains, I think about toys for children, but ordinary children, right? Something you'd find around your Christmas tree, not, if you happen to be the son of the Emperor of France. And so that story really begins in Germany, sometime in the 1400s. Of course, there were no trains then, but the point is that the city of Nuremberg in Germany, starting around the 1400s, was a city that started to specialize in the production of toys for children, in particular dolls, but also other things, doll accoutrements, little toy kitchens and things like that. And with that comes, the development of skill sets like tinsmithery and, fine machining and so on. And so Nuremberg built up all that sort of infrastructure and knowledge starting in the 1400s, and it became a leading toy manufacturing center. In fact, today there is still a Spielwarenmesse, a toy show every year in Nuremberg, where people around the world go to see the latest in toy technology and what's available. So it's and a lot of the toys they made were built for export. It really is a big industry for Nuremberg. And so when trains started to be produced in Germany, first in Germany before basically anywhere else, they were produced in the Nuremberg area. And here's some examples of what some of the companies you would find and some of the toys that they produced. So Bing, Karl Bube, Corette, Ismayer, and Trix all made toys at that time. And they started earlier, except for Trix. Most of them started toy production before they started making trains. And then in the 1880s, 1890s, they started to get into trains. And so here's some examples of the toys that they would make. And one thing I'll call your attention to, besides the fact that these look like metal toys, which is what they are, I'll call your attention to, you can't probably read it, but this says New York Central lines on it, right? And this one says LNWR. That is the London and Northwestern Railway. So yes, all this, or much of this stuff was produced for export. And when we talk about German trains, you have to talk about Märklin, because this is the big manufacturer of trains. And in fact, they're the ones that sort of started the whole thing. The first model trains that are trains you and I might think of as toys played with by ordinary children they were produced by Märklin. And I believe this is the first one. This is basically a floor train, meaning you would tie a string to it and pull around on your floor. The train is circular. Actually, I believe it's a little later than 1880. It was built in they started getting into trains in the early 1890s. The company itself was founded in Göppingen, which is not in Nuremberg, but is nonetheless in southern Germany. It's near Stuttgart, by a guy named Theodor Märklin, and he was a tinsmith. And he originally, in his company, he made dolls, as they did, and accessories, toy accessories for girls. But what happened to poor Theodor is that, well, fortunately for him, he had a very active wife who was very good at traveling around Germany and selling his wares. And so his toy production had to ramp up because she was doing a great job selling his wares. And so he had to move from his original manufacturing site, which was basically his house, to a somewhat larger site. And at that new site, which was also his house, he had downstairs the toy fabrication facility down there. And to get downstairs, he would go through a trap door. So one day, some of his workmen working downstairs left for the day, and they forgot to close the trap door. And so Theodor, not realizing this, was walking around in his house, and he fell through the trap door, and he severely injured himself, and his injuries were so severe that he died. And so this was in the 1860s. His wife had to then pick up the business, and she ran it for the next 20 years, and by all accounts was extremely successful. And then she eventually passed it off to their two sons, and they ran the business. And they're the ones that in the 1890 time frame got Märklin into the business of making toy trains. And so, here are a couple of examples. The first toy trains would have been wind up, right? Not electric. You would have wound it up. I have a wind-up train over there you can look at afterwards. And Märklin was very important because they are the first company that promulgated standards for the size of their trains. They're the ones that invented some scales which we rarely see now, 1, 2, 3, and 4 scale. And then later, O came along, which is the 0. Right? 1 has come back as G scale, but we can talk about that later. So Märklin is really the big German manufacturer, and they're still the big German manufacturer, and they make a lot of stuff for export as well as, German prototypes. So here's one. This is an old Märklin one that says Pabst Blue Ribbon, the beer of quality, and it's signed for the Chicago Northwestern Railway, made by Märklin for export. And like I said, they still exist. Okay, so that's very nice. The toy train, the model train industry really originates in Germany, but very soon, we're interested in America. What happened in America? So very soon, the first American manufacturer of trains started under this company here, Carlisle and Finch. Carlisle and Finch are these two guys. One of them, let's see, Finch was a graduate of the University of Cincinnati, and Carlisle was a graduate of Boston Tech, which is a school we know by a different name now, MIT. So they were in Cincinnati, and what they did, they were both 20 years old or so, 21. They bought the repair business that was run by General Electric in Cincinnati on the second floor of some brick building right downtown in Cincinnati, and they started repairing motors. They did the motor repair that originally, or the previously, General Electric had been doing there. But now they had this shop, they had expertise in engineering and in electricity, they've got money by repairing motors, but that gave them also plenty of time to tinker in their shop. And so they started to invent things, including trains. So here's the first train produced for kids in America, 1897. Right? This is an electric train, so there's a motor inside of it that they would have produced in their shop in Cincinnati. Certainly doesn't look very realistic. This is paper here. But nonetheless, you could put this on track and it would run. And the story goes that Carlisle and Finch, when they came up with the idea to make this thing, they figured, I think we will, can't sell any more than 500 units. That seems like an awful lot. So they made 500 units. And, quickly what happened was they got orders for 1,000 very, very quickly, which sort of tells you there was a lot of pent-up demand out there for model trains. So they were off and running at that point. And here's at this time, advertisement, these were toys for boys. The people at Carlisle and Finch made electric railways. They had an electric coal mine train that you could buy, inclined plane railway, a water power plant. So they made all kinds of things. And this, in fact, okay. Here's another advertisement where you can see all the things they're making in 1912. Gas engine castings, things for young electricians, motors, dynamo castings. They just made all sorts of things. And in fact, they made so many interesting things that they had at least 2 catalogs. They had a catalog B, which is where all their electric train stuff went, and they had a catalog A, which was their line of searchlights. So here's a train of theirs. Let's see, do I have a date on it? I don't have a date on this one, but it's clearly, if you look at this and you look at that, this engine is that. Right? It's pretty clearly, that's a very good drawing of this. So some of the things they made in the very early years were laundry, tumbling dryers. They made electric, a power plant. They made one-shot engines, so people that are interested in old engine technology know about Carlisle and Finch as being a manufacturer at that time. And they made searchlights because they knew a lot about electricity. And what happened was that they got a contract from the government around the World War I time frame to make searchlights for the Navy. And so that's what they still do today. We're still remarkably around. Carlisle and Finch, they make high-end searchlights for the nautical market. And they're still based in Cincinnati. And if you go on Google Maps and you look at Street View, that's what their headquarters looks like. It looks like a ship. It's kind of fun. It looks like the bow of a ship or the stern of a ship. So that's Carlisle and Finch. They got out of trains in, I think, 1916. So they're not doing trains anymore. Rather, they do lighting systems. Another very early railroad manufacturer was Ives. So it was a manufacturing company that made a whole number of goods, founded by Edward Ives, and was located in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And if you go down to Connecticut, you'll find the Historical Society will be happy to tell you all about Edward Ives. They started doing O-gauge trains in 1902, and they were wind-up trains. So here's the key you would use to wind up the train, and then you'd put it on the track. But in 1910, they got into electric trains, and they were the market leader in the 19-teens. They were well ahead of everyone else. But unfortunately for them, they were driven out of business in the 1930s, partially because of, quality issues. And really, it was competition from Lionel and American Flyer, who were the 2 marquee names by the 1930s, that drove them out of business. They just couldn't compete. So they went bankrupt, and then Lionel bought them. But I wanted to point out Ives for a couple of reasons. One is Christmas. Trains are due to arrive on Christmas Day. And the text says, I'll start here, it says, Ives trains are the king of toys in America. No boy's life is complete until he has owned and operated an Ives railroad. Ives toys make happy boys. I mean, that's, I like that. I like that slogan. So this is around 1915, and of course you note the Christmas theme. Here are some example, of toys that they would have made back in the 1924, the middle 1920 time frame. That engine there would have been sort of modeled after the engines that were run by the New York Central into Grand Central Station. So that's Ives. But you really have to talk about Lionel, because I think everyone thinks of Lionel as being the king of the model train business, particularly back then. And Lionel has a lot of interesting stories associated with it. So the company was formed by this guy here, Joshua Lionel is his middle name, Cowan, in 1901. So this guy, he grew up on came from a large Jewish family on the Lower East Side. He grew up on the Lower East Side and was a very clever, very inventive guy. He went to Cooper Union for a while and just took classes because he wanted to learn. He ended up going to Columbia for a while, but then dropped out because he just wanted to work on, his electrical and his inventions. And so one of the first things he did was he invented a little igniter for flash photography. So at that time, you may remember that a photographer would have like a square thing. He would put powder on, and he'd hold it by a handle, and he'd ignite the powder. It would make a flash, and that's how you did flash photography, right? And it's a pretty dicey operation trying to set fire to this flash. Doesn't always work very well. And so what Cowan did was he invented a little gizmo where you could press a button and it would ignite the powder. And this happened to him a couple of times. He invented this thing for one purpose, but what happened was the U.S. military found out about it, and they approached him and said, can you make 25,000 of these because we want to put them into munitions. We want to use those as bomb igniters. And so he did that. He ramped up production, made a large number of these igniters for the military, and when they paid him, he was pretty well off. I believe it was like $25,000, which was real money back in that time frame. And so there he was sitting on a huge pile of money. He was a very inventive guy. What do I do next? He asks. So he partnered with a man named Mr. Grant, and they got a loft in Lower Manhattan, and they started to try to do inventions of various sorts. So one thing there's this workshop. So one thing that happened was that he invented, or maybe his partner invented, a little gizmo where you take some batteries and a little electric light bulb, and you'd take this thing and you'd put it behind a flower pot to illuminate the flowers, to make the flowers look beautiful. And didn't sell that well, but what happened was, and it's a little murky how it all worked out, but what happened was his partner split off and ended up becoming the founder of the Eveready company, making flashlights, right? Because he had effectively invented a flashlight, he just didn't realize what he had. And like I said, some of the stories you hear about him are a little murky because he was pretty good at exaggerating colorful stories about himself. And if you really look into it, I have a book where I read sections about what actually happened in these stories. And the details, of course, are boring and arcane, and the stories that Cowan himself told about himself are much more fun. So you have to take some of these with a grain of salt. His partner invented the flashlight and left, and so there he was, all by himself, with this loft and all of this invention, tools for inventing things. But what to do? He was looking for ideas. He didn't know what to do. And then one day he was walking down the street in Lower Manhattan, and he looked in a shop window. And in the shop window, the shopkeeper had some sort of display of stuff. And Cowan thought, that's boring. What this needs is some sort of a little electrical gizmo that goes around in a circle that he can put his goods in, right? And, make the shop window look more interesting and maybe get more sales. And so what he did was he went into the shop at that point and said, listen, here's what I want to do for you. I'll make you a little gizmo like this with a motor in it. You put it on a track, you electrify it, and it goes around like this in your shop window, and you'll get tons of sales. And so the shop owner said, sure, make 6 for me. And so that's what happened. Cowan made this, put it in the shop window, and immediately the shop owner started to get requests for this. People wanted to buy this. The rest of his stuff, we don't know what happened to the rest of his stuff, but people wanted to buy this. And so here is the catalog from the Lionel Manufacturing Company in 1902, and what he was selling at that point are window display items and holiday gifts, by which we mean trains. I neglected to mention that the name Lionel, of course, comes from Cowan's middle name. He's Joshua Lionel Cowan. So that's why we have the Lionel Corporation. So here's some of the first trains that he made. You'll notice, look at this undercarriage and this undercarriage. They're basically the same as that little cart he made for the shop. So he took that design and repurposed it and put other stuff on top of it. But there it is. There's a 1903 time frame. There's a open trolley car. There, whoops. Sorry about that. There's a boxcar. And of course, later, here is a steam engine. And I have to say, for 1906, if you see some of the other toys we're looking at, this is pretty good. It's good quality stuff. And that was one of the things that Lionel or Cowan prided himself on, was that he was a quality leader. The stuff he was making was realistic by the standards of the time, and it was good quality. And so another thing that he did, we can enjoy this picture of from a 1913 catalog. So the guy was a prolific inventor. He was very clever and came up with all sorts of ideas. And so what he did was he invented all kinds of other accessories he could sell with the trains, right? Which is a good way if you're going to run a business selling trains. You want to have accessories and other stuff to sell so that people will keep buying from you. And so you can see here's the train, here's some sort of station, there's some signal mast here, there's some sort of, I believe this is an amusement park, there's slot cars here, there's a mountain. So he invented all of this stuff, and he would sell it along with the trains. The other thing that's interesting to note is, how is this powered? Well, it's powered by taking a little screw-in thing and screwing it into the socket for a light bulb, right? And then that comes down to something, there's a transformer here, and then there's this gizmo that it's not quite clear what it is, whether it's batteries or something else. But the thing is that the electrical technology used to power trains at this time was pretty dicey. And in fact, the transformers were unreliable and could be dangerous. If you did things incorrectly with some of these setups, you could get a pretty severe shock. And so there was a lot of room for improvement in the electrical setup of trains at that time. And also call attention to the three-rail track, right? Lionel stuff still runs on three-rail track. That was one of his inventions at the time. So another inventor was, or another company was American Flyer. Some of you may have had American Flyer, or probably many have had Lionel trains. So these were started by a guy named Hafner, and he developed O-gauge trains in Chicago starting in about the 1905 time frame. And he sold his trains through the Montgomery Ward, right? And at first he had a different name, but he renamed his company the American Flyer Manufacturing Company in 1910. And so here's an advertisement from that company, 1921. And so we see the happy children. And of course, I want to call attention to the Christmas tree. So there's the Christmas theme again in the advertisement for the trains. So what's interesting about this is that the company was sold to this guy, Albert Gilbert, in 1938. And Gilbert's another interesting and very inventive guy. Here he is. So he went to school out in California for a while, college, and then he came to Yale, became a Yale grad, and he was an Olympic pole vaulter. So what does that have to do with trains? Probably nothing. But anyway, he was an Olympic pole vaulter, and he paid for his college years by being a magician, doing magic shows. And so when he graduated, he started a company called Misto Magic something. So he made magic kits, and he would sell them to children. And he was a smart and clever and energetic guy, so quickly he invented erector sets, right? So I'm sure many people had an erector set when they were children. That was invented by this guy, Gilbert. And then in 1938, he bought the American Flyer line and moved it from Chicago to Connecticut, basically sort of north of New Haven. There's a factory there that is now a museum devoted to this stuff. And all in all, his company emphasized educational toys. Everything he did was sort of pedagogical and educational. And so this is certainly before my time and maybe before the time of people in this room, but one of the things he did that was very popular was he had in New York, he had this thing called the Hall of Science, which was really more of a showroom for various educational toys and things than a shop. And so here it is in the early 40s, and you can see here's a layout, and then there are other exhibits of other sort of educational things that he was up to. And people think that, this might be one of the precursors to what we now think of as Museum of Science, right? Our own Museum of Science is sort of similar in the sense that there's different sort of clever pedagogical exhibits that you want to go to and sort of hopefully make you think. And there's his train in the foreground. So that was Gilbert. And here's some of the toys or trains that were made. So early on, the trains looked like this, right? Not very realistic if you look at it. Huge wheels, that the train cars sit well up off the wheels. So this is pre-Gilbert. This is an engine, 1928, still before Gilbert. But under Gilbert, you can see things are starting to look more like real trains, right? The realism is going up. And so that brings us so we've looked at the 19-teens and the 1920s, and that brings us to the 1930s. And that's when there was sort of this watershed moment in model railroading. A number of things happened in the 1930s. Well, and part of it, I think, was driven by the Depression, right? All of a sudden, lots of people had to stay home, and they were looking for something to do because they didn't have a job. And so many people turned to trains, which also happened during the pandemic. Sales of trains went way up during the recent pandemic because people were at home and looking for something to do. So during this time frame, you had several model railroad magazines founded. The National Model Railroad Association was founded. There was a major catalog retailer that was founded, all in the early 30s. I love this cover from 1930 because it's so bright, and you can see the Hell's Gate Bridge in New York off in the distance, and a village here, and lots of trains in the train yard. The 1930s was when I think the manufacturers realized that model trains were actually is a hobby for men. They've been sold to kids for quite a while, but now men are getting into the action. And that had a number of effects. So for one thing, here is a boxcar from the mid-20s, right? Looks like a toy. Here's a boxcar from the end of the 1930s or the early 1940s. That does not look like a toy. That looks, passably realistic. So this was part of the transition that happened at that time. And it's really characterized by something you can call tinplate versus a scale model. This is tinplate, and that refers to the way it's manufactured. It's basically, this is made from sheet metal that's embossed, right, to put some of the features on it, like the rivets and so on, and then it's enameled, it's painted. So that's tinplate. I have some tinplate over there that you can look at later. But then, at this time, the hobby transitioned to scale models, and where you actually tried really hard to make your rolling stock and your engines look real. And the technologies involved here were first, there's plastic injection molding happening and die cast metal. So those are much better ways to make realistic looking trains. Some of the modeling magazines were founded then. This is a very early shot of the model railroader where somebody is writing about their model railroad. right? They've given it a name, the diminutive and obstinate railroad. Sort of a classic thing. Railroaders like to give their railroads sort of whimsical names. So this is 1934. This is only the 4th edition of the magazine. The Model Craftsman was founded about the same time. This is volume 7. I actually have it in the pile over there. This later became Railroad Model Craftsman, which still exists today. Both of these magazines still exist today. A big thing that happened is, and this really exemplifies the fact that the hobby is now becoming something that men are interested in too. The adults have entered the room. The National Model Railroading Association was created, and that's a volunteer organization that does things like set standards for model trains. It says, okay, if you're going to have a HO train, it has to have, the rails need to be separated by this distance, they need to be this high, they need to be this thick, and the wheels have to have, a certain, the flanges have to be a certain size and so on. And the reason for that was because modelers up to this point, people were forming clubs, and there are stories out there of people, say, in the club in Pittsburgh, wanting to go visit the people in the club in Cleveland, and they'd take their trains up to Cleveland, hoping to run them on the layout, and they couldn't, because although it was nominally HO, nothing was interoperable. And so in 1934, this looks very adult-like, a lot of adult men in a room organizing the standards body, right? It's a bunch of you can imagine a bunch of engineers doing this. In 1935, they found the National Model Railroad Association to set standards, hold conventions, so they hold yearly conventions at many different levels, publish a magazine, publish, of course, regional magazines, a national magazine, local newsletters, sort of promote the hobby as much as they can. And you can regard this as a sign that the hobby is becoming mature. It's being run by adults now. It's not toys anymore. Another thing that happened that was a lot of fun was Chicago World's Fair in 1933. The show owners or the show organizers put a large model train out as one of the exhibits of the model fair. And they expected that the boys would come and look at the trains, and in fact, that happened. Right? Look at these young men in here. They love the train. They're doing something, and they're very interested in it. But also something else happened, and that is all the adult men came to look at the train too. Right? And then there were other layouts at the New York World's Fair. Same thing happened. And there's a large layout at Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, which I visited when I was a kid. And I can tell you I probably spent a long time looking at the layout, taking it all in. So all of these things point to the fact the hobby matured in the 1930s. Okay, I'm going to take a little detour and talk about technology, a couple of aspects of technology. One is the scales. So the scales are now standardized by the NMRA, and that's not just the distance between the tracks, but all the features of the tracks, the wheels, and everything else. So you can buy a train from one manufacturer and reasonably expect that it will run on track made by a totally different manufacturer. And one gentleman who's come to see the lecture tonight has set up a demo over there showing the different scales. And so after the talk, you can go look at the different scales. Also in the 1940s, so the transition is gone. People are transitioning from O, which was the typical Lionel scale, and even S, which was the American Flyer scale, and are starting to get into HO, right? O was the zero gauge. Remember, that was one less than the 1, 2, 3, and 4 that Märklin came up with. So this was a 0. And HO is half O. It's roughly half the size. So that's why it's HO. Track. So this is the old 3-rail Lionel track. This is 2-rail HO. This is a reason why people, prefer HO. It just simply looks more realistic, right? You have 2 rails. That's enough to pass current to the motor on the train and for the current to return. Why did Cowan do this 3-rail thing, right? Why is it still around? That's another question. But the reason for the 3 rails is that in the very early days of manufacturing trains, you could not reliably have two metal wheels connected via, or you'd had to connect them together, and you couldn't connect them with something that was non-conductive. So typically you had to connect your metal wheels with a metal shaft, and a technology for insulating one wheel from the other really didn't exist. And so that being the case, the outer rails were always going to short to one another by the wheels on the train. And so what Cowan did was he put a third track down the middle, and then every engine would have a little pickup right in the middle that would pick up the current from the middle track and then could send it to either the two or both rails as the ground rail. The problem with that is that it just doesn't look realistic, right? And so these days, this three-rail stuff is almost, at least in this country, is almost exclusively an O-scale thing if you have Lionel trains. And everyone else does the realistic HO track, or the realistic track that looks like this. Transformers. I mentioned that the very early transformers could be dangerous. You could shock yourself, or they might catch fire, or something bad could happen. So this Lionel, or Cowan himself, being a very clever, being a very smart guy, invented a safe transformer, which he marketed under the name the Lionel multivolt transformer. And that's what you see here. You can control the speed of your train here. The terminals here never have hazardous voltages appear on them, so it's safe for kids. And he marketed the thing here. This is the 1924 catalog, the Lionel electric toy trains and multi-volt transformers is what he put on his catalog. And it's kind of fun because you see here these boys they're behaving like boys. They've got the train running at high speed and they're chasing the dog. But if you look at his hand here, his hand is actually on this transformer as he's cranking up the speed to chase the dog. So it's another innovation from Cowan. Okay, World War II, train production basically shut down, and all of the manufacturing sites went to manufacturing munitions and stuff for the war effort. And some of them even advertised, like this one here, that they've got this bursting factory full of stuff going on, but dear boys, sorry, we can't be making trains because we're working on the war effort, but as soon as we are able to, we'll get back into making trains for you. And so that happened after World War II. I'll show you some 1950s catalogs in just a second, but by the 50s, HO is becoming entrenched as the dominant manufacturer for at least people that want scale models. Children are still getting Lionel trains, but people wanting to do scale modeling are in HO. And really, at the end of the 50s, Lionel started to lose its way, which is kind of sad. Cowan by then was about 80, and he was experiencing slowly but surely declining sales. And I think that once he left the company at the end of the 1950s, they sort of went in this weird direction. And that's exemplified here in this 1959 catalog. If you look at what's going on here, you've got this is a 19th century train with an American engine on the front here burning, that's burning wood. And you can see the smoke coming out. Here's a train from the early 1900s. But then you've got this going on. You've got this weird U.S. Army train that's shooting missiles. There's some sort of missile command on the ground shooting missiles this way. You've got missiles flying all over the place. And you've got a fallout shelter. This is weird to me. I think that they've completely lost their way if they're trying to sell that. And another thing that happened that was sort of unfortunate is that Cowan himself sold his Lionel shares, all of his shares, to his nephew, Roy Cohn. And some of you may remember Roy Cohn as being a fairly notorious individual in the 1950s, participated in the House Un-American Activities Committee, and later was a political fixer in New York, and sort of a very not positive character. And you can imagine that when Cowan sold his shares, so Roy Cohn was his nephew, so there was a family relation. When Cowan sold his shares, his son, who had been running the company, of course, wondered, what about me? What happened? And so there were a lot of fighting that happened. Cowan himself ran the company from 1959 to 1963 when he was kicked out, which is, it's kind of odd to think of a person like that running essentially a toy company, but that's what happened. Okay, so in my blurb for this talk, I said that I would try to answer the question, why do we think about the train around the Christmas tree at Christmas time? And I think the answer is pretty obvious, and it's a very American answer too, and the answer is advertising. Right? It was advertised, trains and Christmas were advertised together for decades and decades. Here's a real Lionel electric train for Christmas. Zingo, how it speeds away. 1917. And then 1951, the most wonderful Christmas in any boy's life. Right? So that Christmas theme was hit constantly. And it makes, all the manufacturers did this, not just Lionel, and it makes perfect sense. Right? If you're a 6-year-old kid, like if you're a boy, you want a train, but you don't have the money to buy a train. On the other hand, trains aren't so expensive that parents can't buy them for Christmas and give them as fabulous Christmas gifts. So it all fits together. The marketing people at these organizations, they understood that, and they pumped the Christmas message all the time. And another message they pumped is the father and son thing, right? So here, it's all about dad. It's something dad and son can do together. So here's son, here's dad, there's the train. Here's son, here's dad, here's the train. And this one, we get a bonus because it's a Lionel train Christmas. It's not just father-son, but it's also Christmas. And then, of course, father and son. Right? So this point was also hammered home by the advertising campaigns of the time. And it makes perfect sense. And then finally, occasionally, we even get the whole family. And I think this is a funny Lionel catalog, 1949 catalog. So sister and mother, they kind of like the train. It's interesting. That's cute. And dad likes the train, but look at this kid. He's sobbing because he wants the train so much. You can see that on his face. He just wants the train. Yeah, I love that one. Okay, so we're getting towards the end, but I want to highlight a few famous model railroaders, or infamous. So this is a very unhappy one. Hermann Goering was, a Nazi commander of the Luftwaffe and was regarded as second in command to Hitler. Well, he had in his estate, up in his attic, he had a large train set. And when he would have parties for the Nazi, the people running the show, the bigwigs, they would go upstairs and hang out with his train set. He's a thoroughly hateful character. He was eventually convicted at Nuremberg in 1946 and committed suicide in his cell the day before he was to be executed. So thoroughly disreputable character. However, on a happy side, some of you may recognize this guy, Rod Stewart, right? He was big in the 70s. This is not my kind of music, but I'm sure many people will remember Do You Think I'm Sexy and You're in My Heart and all of that. So here he is. He is in the model railroad press fairly frequently, talking about his train. And you might think, what's a British rocker doing with a model train? It seems sort of nerdly, right? It's sort of geeky and awkward and gawky. But he explains it very well. This guy is on the road maybe half a year, every year, doing shows. And if you're a rocker, right, after the show, well, there's the parties and women throwing themselves at you. There's tons of booze, free drugs. And it sounds like, it would be fun, right? But no, very quickly you'll spiral down and that would be the end of that. And so what he does is he brings a couple of suitcases with him with little models in them, and after his show and before his show he'll sit in his hotel room and work on his models, building structures, making houses and so on. It's constructive and it's positive. And then finally, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, when he was, wealthy and famous, he had an estate out in California called Rancho Mirage. And in one of his outbuildings, he built this large O-scale Lionel layout. And so here it is. To me, it's a little toy-like, but that's fine. Everyone has their own thing. So here's his layout. And the story is that he used to tour with Tommy Dorsey, the big band Tommy Dorsey. And he visited Tommy Dorsey's house once, and Tommy Dorsey had a train, and that's when Frank Sinatra said, "That's cool." And then later in his life, when he had the time and the money and the space, he built his dream layout here. There it is. Yeah, so today, I would challenge anyone in this room, if you didn't know what this talk was about, to tell me, is that a realistic, is that a real engine, or is that a model? Right? As somebody that knows the area, I can look at the coupler and say, yeah, that's a oversized coupler, it's a plastic coupler. But the rest of it, particularly if it was weathered a little bit, you couldn't tell the difference between this and an actual train. So today, you can buy extremely realistic models from high-end companies for $300 to $500. So it's not something that kids do, but it is something that retired men do. And the models are just fantastic. So the hobby is alive and well in that way. And of course, all of this is made possible by, ever-improving technology. Injection molding, different materials, and so on and so forth made this layout, this level of modeling possible. So I'll say thank you to Patsy, and thank you for listening. I should say thanks to the Train Collectors Association of America, which actually made this talk very easy because a lot of the shots were from their website, so I should acknowledge that. And I wanted to end with this because I just wanted to remind everybody that Ives toys make happy boys. So thank you. Thanks. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but Fred Gavalt there he is. He has a layout at his house just down the street on Academy Street, and he's graciously invited people to come see his layout, if you wish, right after the talk. And I think what people will see you, and they can come to you, and you can lead a small group down to your house when you're ready.
Well, let me just say that this is in my basement. I can accommodate a few people tonight. I will give you my email address, and I'm retired and not doing much. So we can set up a time and a date if you're more anxious to go home and go to bed. But I stay up pretty late. I can take 6 to 8 tonight, probably in a couple of groups if you want to hang around. And we're just up the street at the brow.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out to me and suggesting that. It's a gracious offer. So, okay, I'll take a couple questions and then we should, yes?
To what do you attribute the gender specificity about the boys? Is it to keep them out of trouble, or did they not have any other toys, or what?
Boys dig this stuff. I don't know why.
Girls, okay, so do girls, but yeah.
I would I don't want to come across as a male chauvinist pig, but I belong to a club and it's all guys. You go to a train show, it's all guys. And it's not because people are being kept out, it's just interest. I don't know why. The train manufacturers tried. In fact, one thing that when Lionel was losing its way in about 1966, they came out with a pink train set, and as a way to get girls interested in the hobby. A pink, the whole train set was pink, and it flopped naturally, right? I don't know. Yeah.
Stuart, I would point out there's an organization under the NMRA, Women in Model Railroading, and there are now approximately about 15%
Yeah.
people in the hobby now.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would invite you to go and buy a train and set it up and run it. I saw a question in back too.
My uncle was New York Central safety director.
Yeah.
So we just kind of took for granted that trains were part of culture and commerce. But I'm wondering, was there ever any intersection between model railroading and the various railroad lines? Because certainly they got some free advertising.
Yeah, there's a famous case I was telling somebody about earlier this evening. So early on, Union Pacific actually paid Lionel to put Union Pacific logos on the side of their stuff, many decades ago. But only 20, 25, or maybe 30 years ago, Union Pacific sued Lionel and one other manufacturer saying that's a copyright infringement or that's trademark infringement. And so Lionel and the other train manufacturers now have to buy, licenses to put their logos, put the actual railroad's logos on the side of the boxcars, which is too bad, really, but that's how things work nowadays. Yes, Elaine?
You mentioned this already, I apologize if I missed it, but the German companies that were making toys before trains were introduced,
Yeah.
are they making any other mechanical toys?
Märklin? So Märklin at one time also made Meccano kits, which are like the European equivalent of erector sets. I'm a little unclear on exactly what time frame that was happening in. I don't think it was pre-trains, but maybe sort of early part of the 20th century. These guys, Märklin.
Okay, you're certainly welcome to come and talk more with Stuart and to see the displays here, and for some people to go down the street. Thank you, Stuart, for an absolutely delightful and informative program.
You're welcome. It's fun to be back. Thank you, Patsy.
Cars for like $6. This is back in the 90s. $6 for that, $12 for a passenger car. Now passenger cars are like $25, $40. And freight cars have gone up too with the locomotives. So they're always more expensive.
You're trying to. Stuff that's like that. I have no idea.